My name is Andrew Leung. I'm a China strategist. You started off by referring to the Westphalian principle. It seems that the world and nations nowadays are more prepared to give up a degree of their sovereign Westphalian sovereignty in the interest of the global commons. Examples, of course, there are not too many, but they are credible in the case of the WTO and also exemplified by the recent global accord in Paris on climate change. So it is possible, but my question to you is on one specific example, which perhaps illustrates the difficulties of this post-Westphalian world. In the case of ISIS, now, of course, apart from the violence and extremism, some adherents do believe that that's their vision, and a lot of people are prepared to die for it. So how are you going to accommodate this kind of challenge to the global system? And how are you going to use your examples of inclusivity, pluralism, to address this perhaps most dangerous phenomenon of the 21st century?
Well, it's a very important and fundamental question. I just note that in the first place, ISIS or ISIL or Daesh, whatever it's called, is already a kind of transnational political community. It's seeking authority across existing national lines, but it is also a kind of political community that is justifying its claims to the membership of its people and its treatment of outsiders through precisely the kinds of religious claims that I said should be subjected to strict and skeptical scrutiny. Now, who should subject those claims to the strict and skeptical scrutiny? That needs to be done by adherents of Islam in the region and throughout the world who argue against those religious claims for the legitimacy of the kind of political community, the kind of authority, and the kind of policies that ISIS is pursuing. I am not so optimistic that I think political mobilization around this kind of ethic where you challenge these extravagant religious claims to entitlement to engage in horrible military actions, that's not going to be enough. I do think it's vital, but it's not enough. Unfortunately, we do not live in a world where we can resolve all problems through persuasion and argument alone. There will need to be military action to prevent ISIS aggression from expanding. I hope ultimately either to eliminate it as a political community or create conditions under which it is transformed into a drastically more moderate political movement. There will need to be military force. But even in regard to military force, that military force is likely to be much more effective if it is multilateral military force that includes political communities that are recognized as legitimate by Islamic believers, that are representative, so that it's at least in part one form of Islam against another rather than Western crusaders against Islam, which is a formula for disaster. So I think that the kinds of political movements I'm talking about, which include both criticisms of the kind of claims to absolute authority on religious or other grounds that ISIS is advancing, and military actions that are more effective because they are multilateral and include those who are advancing critiques from within the Islamic community, as it were, of the legitimacy of ISIS. We need both those things if we're to reduce this threat.
Okay. Next. Okay. Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Tomáš Vasilček, and I'm an exchange student from Czech Republic. First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for your lecture and for the interesting information you shared with us. And My question concerns mostly the situation in Europe today with the refugee crisis and the attitudes of people. You mentioned Europe on several occasions, but I want to ask because what I observe in debating with different people, including college-educated adults, is that a lot of them would, there's some kind of growing favorability for, or growing attachment toward nation states. At least it seems to be going somewhat different direction nowadays. So why would you say that many people so far seem to have different opinion, and through what mechanism do you think that this opinion that you favor can influence the politicians and the people? Thank you.
Thank you. It is undeniably true that we are seeing a resurgence of particularistic nationalisms in many regions of Europe. We're seeing it in other parts of the world today, but it's particularly prominent in Europe right now, in part because of the reaction to the immediate Syrian refugee crisis, but also the more long-standing concerns about rising number of primarily Muslim immigrants to Europe. And I suggested that there's nothing inevitable about the trends that I have been discussing. They create circumstances under which we make political choices, and as Mark said, men make history, but not under circumstances of their own choosing. We have circumstances that are making new forms of political community possible, but there's no guarantee that the choices to make those kinds of political communities will be made. It is nonetheless true that if you take a longer historical perspective, these resurgent nationalisms that we're seeing are reactions against trends that are moving away from their preferred direction, and it's not clear that the reactions are going to succeed. I can say this more easily today because last week Marine Le Pen's National Front Party in France was leading in all the polls and was supposed to capture a number of regions. In the actual election, they captured no regions. They are a significant force, but there are counter forces. And in the slide I put up with the different flags beyond the Westphalian world, the truth is that all those flags were flags of nations that now belong to the European Union. And it's important to understand that even though there's a lot of resistance to the European Union, if you look at the political trajectory of the last half century, the movement toward integration has made remarkable strides. The European Union began as just the European Coal and Steel Agreement, and then it became the common market. But even then, people said it's not going to go much further. But then it became the European Union, and then it fostered a kind of European citizenship, and it led to movements to create a constitution of Europe, which have not yet succeeded. There's pushback against them. But if you're looking at the long-term historical trajectory, it looks like the forces are moving more toward the possibility of greater integration, and that is precisely why we're getting the angry nationalist reaction. People feel that the tide of history is going against them. And fundamentally, I think they're right, or at least if satisfactory supranational institutions can be built, then the tide of history will go against them.
Okay, I see many hands. So the lady there and the gentleman, I see colleague there, and maybe Linda, the third. Okay.
Hi, I'm Shusif. I'm the novelist from the English department. You have made reference to storytelling or narrative as relevant, I suppose, to this definition of political personhood. So I'd like to ask you to talk about the story that we tell ourselves of the patriotism, which is entirely tied to the nation state, and how that figures in your perspective, which is a very optimistic one, hopeful, for moving beyond sovereignty. Thank you.
Well, a big concern of my writing over the last 10 or 12 years, beginning with my book, Stories of Peoplehood, and then continuing through the essays, some of which are collected in the new book, has been precisely to examine the characteristics of the kinds of narratives that leaders advance and that people embrace, fostering a sense of common political identity, including a sense of patriotism. And I've found the work of literary scholars useful to me in thinking about how these political stories work. But I would say that there are many such stories, and they're also tied to many forms of political community. It's not clear that the patriot has to be a patriot to a nation state. The patriot has to be loyal to a political community, but there have been many forms of political community historically, and there are many forms today. It is the primacy of the nation state as a global political structure. Really, it didn't become fully hegemonic until the second half of the 20th century. Much of the world was constructed in terms of empires before that. And in this regard, I like to quote a saying from the first ethnic society in the United States, which happened to be founded a short distance from where I now live, outside the city of Philadelphia. And the Welsh immigrants who played a big role in settling Pennsylvania, they formed the Welsh Society of Philadelphia. And in their charter, they said, "We can be good citizens of the world and of our nation and of our kinsmen without any disloyalty to any of them. You can have a sense of patriotism you can be a faithful patriot of Europe as well as of Wales. You can have a certain sense of global citizenship as well as patriotism toward your nation states. The capacity of human beings to devise and tell effective political stories is not so narrow as to be confined to this recent, relatively historically recent form of political community, and you can inspire allegiance in lots of different ways. But it is a challenge to do so.
Okay, next.
Yes. Thank you very much. My name is Mark Thompson. I work here at the City University of Hong Kong. Thanks very much for this talk. I'm glad to finally have seen you in person, followed your work for many years with great admiration. However, today I want to join others who are suggesting you're perhaps a bit too optimistic. And let me offer just a few examples of why pessimism may be the more plausible scenario. I mean, you mentioned the EU. One of the great successes of shared sovereignty, semi-sovereign situation, it's in its greatest crisis, arguably, since its foundation. And I mean, it's worth pointing out why. It's not just the migration. Before that, it was the Euro crisis. It splits the EU between the north, Germany, the Scandinavian states, and the south, Spain, Portugal, Greece, perhaps even Italy, as well as then east and west. And let's not forget we have an electoral authoritarian regime in Hungary, which the EU has been unable to deal with. Poland looks like it's going that direction, Czech Republic being a notable exception, I might point out. So Europe is perhaps its biggest crisis in decades. And if that is a case you want to make for hope, I think that is rather distressing. Here in East Asia, China is becoming more repressive. The crackdown on human rights increases. The white paper on Hong Kong and the Occupy movement suggest things are moving in an opposite direction to what you suggest here. China is very interested not in what you're talking about, but in things like the Singapore model and effective, efficient, non-corrupt authoritarianism, but authoritarianism nonetheless. And with the rise of China, we have, for the first time since Imperial Germany, Meiji Japan, the Soviet Union, a major, important authoritarian power that obviously is going to be very influential. It already is in places like Africa and elsewhere. And that's going to really change the world dramatically. And their attitudes toward sovereignty, clear in the South China Sea, disputes with Japan. Of course, there are also disputes between Japan and South Korea. If one misses 19th century nationalism, look to East Asia. It's still very much in that kind of old-fashioned mode around here. And finally, just a comment about Trump and Le Pen. Yes, they may also only be about a third of the electorate, it looks like, in both countries. But there's an interesting argument to be made about middle classes, worries of the middle classes. You may be familiar with Theodore Geiger's argument from the 1930s, the anxiety of the middle class driving the German middle classes into the arms of the Nazi Party. So, you know, there are anxieties. Some of the trends you point to seem to be pushing people away from this more open-minded, tolerant attitude. Thank you.
I don't deny or dismiss the fact that there are major sources for concern that you have identified very well. And again, I'm not predicting that the kind of direction that I'm suggesting is desirable is simply going to happen. I'm rather suggesting that it may be worth trying to make happen, and we can dispute whether that is, but then I'd be interested in hearing what's the alternative direction that we might want to pursue. If we do go in this direction, we have to try and do it well. And I think in the case of the European Union and the euro crisis, the case is strong. It was strong at the time that the creation of the euro was premature in a way that contributed to the financial difficulties of Europe. If Greece had had its own currency, it would have had greater capacities to cope with its economic difficulties. And I think that that is a telling example that you can't rush prematurely into forms of economic federation that with regional differences that still represent great disparities that can't easily be harmonized. Nonetheless, the movement of people, free movement of people and goods in Europe is something that I think is deeply entrenched and likely to be enduring. I was at a conference in Vienna last year in which there was tremendous concern over the fate of the European project, and I am not denying that it is embattled now. But at the same time, the former economics minister of Italy noted that, yes, there's all this concern about resurgent nationalism and can Europe hold together. But if you look at the young people of Europe, you know, when I was young and traveled to Europe for the first time, we had to stop at every border and show our passports and get visas, and it was cumbersome, inefficient, sometimes scary. The young people of Europe find that simply inconceivable. They take it as a kind of natural right that they're entitled to move throughout the European region. There are certain kinds of consolidation that have taken hold. And so I regard it not as a cause for certain optimism, but also not as a cause for gloomy despair and abandonment of efforts at change that we see resistance. It is only to be expected that we see resistance. It doesn't guarantee the resistance will fail. It is an open question, but it doesn't guarantee the resistance will succeed either. And I certainly recognize the appeal of authoritarian nationalistic models and their association with evidence of successful economic growth in East Asia. These are fundamental realities of contemporary global politics that need to be taken into account. But there is reason to think that there's a potential in the longer view for these authoritarian but nonetheless more and more globally interconnected economies to create conditions in which sustaining authoritarian nationalist rule becomes more difficult over time. But to some degree, I regard the question of how optimistic or pessimistic we should be as somewhat beside the point, because whatever we view our circumstances as being, whether the chances are, whether the road is easy or the road is hard, the important question is to decide what road it makes sense to go on. And I think that the road I'm talking about is the right road to go on, and my optimism only extends to arguing that it's not so clear that it will inevitably fail in the long run that we shouldn't even give it a try.
Okay.
Linda Lee from the university. These days we have been talking a lot about harm, okay, trying to avoid people doing harm to us and then, protecting ourselves, withdrawing, as far as possible for greater security. So I think this is musical to my ears when I, heard about you talk about giving aid to others. I think this is very much about this getting this win-win, in this community and in the global communities as well. I think, so actually I'm going to send you some ammunition for your argument. You asked about...
Good, I could use one. Last guy had me on the ropes. So.
Yeah. You asked about China, right?
Yeah.
I think, despite that, we have a lot of this, negative developments in China, which tell us about harm, okay, right. Including what Mark mentioned, okay, including Occupy Central in China, in Hong Kong. But I think there is one remarkable development that we cannot miss, and that actually, aligns with what you emphasize in Europe. That is migration, right? You emphasize the migration,
right?
Free movement, relatively free movement of people and resources across the continent. This is actually happening, for 2 decades, and increasingly free, across the whole of China. That's what I'm referring to rural migration. Okay, migration of farmers, who live in the countryside to towns and cities. And more recently, the government has changed the policy, and so they are giving, we may call this the citizenship is still, not with the same, attachment of goods and services, but much more improved. Yeah. Okay, much more improved. So I think that they are moving in that direction. Very, very difficult, but they are, this is actually a very positive development that we cannot all ignore. So even though China has not been opening all its borders to the rest of the world, to Africa, but I don't think it needs to. After all, 25% of global population is in China. So if we take care of this internal diversity and inequality within China, this is actually a terrific accomplishment. And I think this is actually I have a question for you, and I think because when we have what you're advocating is it is an objective, right? It's an orientation. We should think more about aid. And without harming ourselves, that's the bottom line. But actually, a lot of people say that, well, it depends on your perspective, right? Because if I give away $1, it means harming myself. I could have the $1 for myself, right? So it's really, a perspective. Whether I need that additional $1, right? Yes. So sometimes, how to enhance the capacity, right? To feel that I don't need that one additional $1, and how to distribute that one additional $1 to the rest, right? And that I think that is the capacity building is actually the essential gap. That's you mentioned that actually in the United States, the aspiration to aid principle is not well established. But you mentioned very, very rightly, the United States is the richest and strongest nation in the world, right? And by total capacity and by per capita still. So if the strongest country cannot do that, I think it is very pessimistic. But I agree with you. We cannot afford to be pessimistic. We simply have to think out the strategy towards it. So I'd like to hear more of your insights on that.
I think, well, first on your the ammunition you provide me. I think that is a very important point. Unlike when I speak in the United States or recently in Japan, and I do say wealthier nations should recognize that they would benefit from immigrants, and including low-skilled immigrants, and that this would reduce global poverty, that's not a message for China, because China is still, even with its rapid economic growth, a developing nation in some regards, and it has plenty of labor. It doesn't need the unskilled labor in the way that the United States and Japan do. The challenge here is, as you say, to permit some internal immigration flows. And when I came to China 20 years ago and I spoke at Wuhan University, there were people moving in from the countryside, but there was a lot of resistance to it, and there were you could lose social rights by moving and so forth. And although those problems persist, what you say about greater receptivity over time is, I think, significant positive development, and the kind of positive development appropriate to China. It wouldn't make sense for China to seek African immigrants. That the situation is very different. The U.S. should be open to African immigrants for a variety of reasons. In terms of the question of how do you get people to foster a willingness to aid others without harming themselves, they might define any effort to aid others as a harm to themselves. It's a real challenge. I think that we have to encourage people to ask themselves, we have to ask ourselves, well, what are our real important aspirations? What are the things that are fundamental to our pursuits of happiness? And then we have to ask if those are harmed or not, And is it really true that each and every extra dollar is essential to our happiness? Probably not. And in fact, if we see ourselves as people for whom the core of our pursuit of happiness is always to get one more dollar, that's not really an inspiring self-image. I don't think that makes a lot of people feel great about themselves. I know that commercial pursuits are big in Hong Kong, and so there are plenty of people who want to get rich, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with getting with wanting to acquire wealth. But the notion that each and every additional dollar is essential to my pursuit of happiness, I don't think many people on reflection would actually embrace that image of themselves. It's a rather diminished view of who you are, what you care about, what you want to be. And so if you do think about what really is vital to who you are, what you care about, and what you want to be, it can become clear that you actually can afford to give some aid. You might even find that who you are, what you care about, and what you want to be involves giving aid.
Hi, Professor Smith. It's my pleasure to listen to you again. You taught me at Yale many years ago. I'm Thomas Cheng, and I teach at the University of Hong Kong.
I remember you.
Yeah, I'm sure. But I was wondering how you perceive the relationship of these semi-sovereign groups to be with international organizations. I mean, are their interests and to be mediated through existing nation states as well, or I mean, how do these semi-sovereign groups interact with multinational organizations?
I remembered you once you spoke. You sound the same. So the yes is the short answer. That is to say, I'm not calling for an abolition of nation states. I am calling for them to recognize that they can claim sovereignty in some areas, not in others, and for them to be willing to recognize that a person with dual citizenships might have certain obligations to the other country, that a person who belongs to a religious community or a cultural community might have obligations to those communities that the nation state should respect. Similarly, the authorities within those communities should recognize that as long as they are pursuing their group ways of life within the nation state, they do have to recognize the authority of the nation state in certain areas as well. And it is a matter of ongoing political negotiation, exactly what those boundaries should be. How far does the nation state feel it can and should defer to religious communities that might have different ways of life? For example, the Church of the Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, as well as new immigrant groups in the United States, practice plural marriage, or did historically, and some Mormon denominations still do. Do you accommodate that, or do you not? There may be different answers at different times. At the same time, the Mormon Church, which originally set out to establish itself as a theocracy, has recognized the authority of the United States government in certain regards. That kind of process of multiple semi-sovereign communities, including nation states, engaging in an evolving negotiation of the respective spheres of authority is the kind of world I'm envisioning. It may sound, oh, that's unrealistic, it's messy, it may be too optimistic. The truth is that that is the kind of world that we have in practice already. There is always negotiation going on between different communities about their respective ranges of authority. What I'm arguing for in some ways is honest recognition of that reality rather than pretending that one community does have and should have absolute authority over all others. The truth is that so-called sovereign nation states have never been absolutely sovereign. They have always had to negotiate with communities inside and outside their borders on a range of issues. And I'm saying that it would be healthy to recognize that and do it in a more constructive spirit rather than seeing every concession as a loss of this mystical sovereignty that leaders want to claim, but no community has ever really had.
Okay, finally, Alex.
Thank you very much. That was an inspiring vision, and I think I'm starting to become more persuaded, but there's one element where I was quite surprised, and I'm still thinking through. You get used to, when thinking about the European Union, of thinking about economic free movement of capital and goods and democratic deficits to kind of go in opposite directions.
Yeah.
And have both of them as a disadvantage of the nation state. I mean, in the European situation, the idea of democratic deficit comes from the complaint that all this free movement of capital undermines the possibility to have maybe a redistributive welfare state, maybe the kind of measures that a country would want to have instead of austerity measures. And so I'm wondering, isn't the nation state's role been to a certain extent to counter global capitalism and to resist moves of, don't those go in opposition? Don't we usually see things like the World Trade Organization allowing corporations to sue nation states in order to remove their health legislation or to remove things that might be considered your typical redistributive politics in the name of movement and capital? And shouldn't we worry about these two different directions?
So I think that there do need to be governing institutions with countervailing power to capitalist enterprises and interests. That I accept. It's not clear to me that the nation state has been the supreme and effective countervailing power against capitalist interests. Historically, indeed, I'd say the nation state system grew up more in partnership and service of capitalist interests than it did in opposition to it. There are times when nation state governing institutions, which do have some relative autonomy from economic structures, I believe, do resist capitalist interests. But on the whole, the growth of the nation state system has accompanied and I think reinforced the growth of global capitalism. Look at the timing, late 19th through the 20th century. That's the heyday of the nation state system. I think that we do need to have, and I also think that there is some value in free trade zones and promoting economic growth, and economic growth makes possible kinds of redistributive measures that you can't have if you don't have anything to redistribute. So there's a a trade-off there, but there is some advantage in free movements of goods, capital, and labor. They are associated with economic growth, and bigger pie helps solve a lot of problems. But I think you're exactly right to stress that the moving in the kind of direction I describe has to include the creation of transnational economic institutions that represent governing institutions that can play a role in regulating and providing countervailing power against capitalist development. I just think that in a world of multinational corporations, a global economy, you're probably not going to be able to control capitalism very well through nation-state institutions alone. You are going to need some transnational institutions. We do need them, and we need to strengthen them, I think.
Okay, with this, we end our Q&A session. And thank you so much for all these interesting questions. I really appreciate Professor Smith trying to answer all these questions. Thank you so much for your generosity. Okay,
thank you.
This has been a CDU's long tradition to present a souvenir to our distinguished speaker. So rather than I'm presenting this, am I? Okay, okay, okay. Okay, thank you so much.